Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching the Pacific horizon blur into morning mist on June 4, 1942. The same man who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu steamed in perfect formation, their decks bristling with over 100 aircraft. Victory seemed inevitable. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was elegant in its complexity. The Midway operation would serve as both conquest and trap, drawing the weakened American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japanese naval superiority would crush them once and for all. Yamamoto had divided his massive fleet into multiple task forces. The carrier striking force under Nagumo would neutralize Midway's defenses, while the main body under Yamamoto's direct command would engage and destroy the American fleet when it inevitably responded. According to declassified U.S. Navy intelligence reports from 1945, the Japanese plan involved coordinating 11 separate task forces across thousands of miles of ocean. But 300 miles away rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise already knew they were coming. The Americans had achieved what the Japanese thought impossible. They had broken the enemy's naval code. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications, revealing not just the target, but the exact timing and composition of the attacking force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Pacific Fleet Commander, had positioned his 3 available carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway in a carefully planned ambush. The morning sun climbed higher as Nagumo's carriers began launching their first wave against Midway. 108 aircraft roared off the flight decks in perfect coordination, Kate torpedo bombers, Valdive bombers, and Zero fighters forming up in precise formations. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike, confident that within hours Midway's airfield would be reduced to smoking ruins. On Midway itself, radar operators watched in horror as their screens filled with approaching contacts. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marine fighters scrambled to intercept. The obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and handful of Wildcats were hopelessly outmatched by the Zeros, but they climbed into the morning sky anyway, knowing they were buying precious time with their lives. As the first bombs began falling on Midway's installations, the intricate Japanese plan was already beginning to unravel. The attack, while devastating, failed to completely neutralize the airfield. More critically, Tominaga radioed back that a second strike would be necessary, a recommendation that would prove fatal to Japanese naval coordination. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo faced his first crucial decision. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking enemy ships. But Tominaga's request meant rearming them with land attack ordnance for a second strike on Midway. The admiral gave the fatal order to rearm, beginning a complex process that would leave his carriers vulnerable at the worst possible moment. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers were already airborne, racing across the empty Pacific toward his fleet. The trap was closing, and the perfect Japanese plan was about to collide with American determination and superior intelligence. The deck of Akagi became a scene of controlled chaos as ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm. Nagumo's aircraft, armor-piercing bombs, and torpedoes meant for enemy ships were wheeled below decks, while high-explosive bombs for land targets were brought up from the magazines. The process, normally taking an hour under ideal conditions, stretched longer as fuel hoses snaked across the deck and ammunition handlers struggled with their deadly cargo. Admiral Nagumo paced the bridge, torn between conflicting priorities. His training demanded that he prepare for the second strike on Midway, but decades of naval experience whispered warnings about leaving his fleet vulnerable. The 4 carriers maintained their tight formation, steaming northwest at 24 knots, their combat air patrol of Zero fighters circling overhead like protective hawks. At 7:58 that morning, everything changed. The cruiser Tone's search plane, delayed in launch by mechanical problems, Finally radioed a contact report that sent ice through Nagumo's veins. Have sighted 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distance to 140 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The message transformed the entire tactical situation. American ships were exactly where they shouldn't be according to Japanese intelligence estimates. Yamamoto's plan assumed the American fleet would be hundreds of miles away in Pearl Harbor, requiring days to respond to the Midway attack. Instead, they were already in position, already threatening the Japanese carriers. Nagumo's staff officers clustered around the radio as follow-up messages trickled in. The search plane had spotted what appeared to be cruisers and destroyers, but no carriers. This partial intelligence created a deadly uncertainty. Were these merely screening forces, or was the entire American Pacific Fleet lurking just beyond the horizon? The admiral faced an impossible decision. His aircraft were half rearmed for the second Midway strike, making them useless for attacking ships. Completing the rearming process would take another hour, during which his fleet would remain vulnerable to attack. Alternatively, he could reverse the process and rearm with anti-ship weapons, but that would abandon the Midway operation and potentially waste the element of surprise. At 8:20, another message arrived that sealed the fate of the Japanese fleet. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. The single sentence shattered Japanese assumptions about American capabilities and positioning. Nagumo now faced not distant cruisers but active enemy carriers, capable of launching immediate strikes. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's official U.S. Navy history notes that this intelligence failure represented a complete breakdown in Japanese reconnaissance coordination. The order went out immediately to reverse the rearming process. Ordnance crews, already exhausted from the morning's work, began the dangerous task of switching weapon loads again. High explosive bombs were struck below while armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes were brought back up. Fuel hoses continued snaking across the decks as returning aircraft from the first Midway strike needed immediate refueling. But time was running out faster than anyone aboard the Japanese carriers realized. At 9:25, lookouts spotted the first American attack formations approaching from the northeast. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had found the Japanese fleet through navigation skill and sheer determination. The combat air patrol zeros dove on the lumbering Devastator torpedo bombers like wolves on sheep. One by one, the American aircraft were shot down in flames, their slow speed and outdated design making them easy targets for the nimble Japanese fighters. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo 8, only one survived the slaughter, and it was so damaged that it couldn't return to the Hornet. Nagumo watched the massacre with grim satisfaction, but the attack had accomplished something far more valuable than any successful torpedo strike. The defending Zeros had been drawn down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches temporarily undefended. More critically, the Japanese combat air patrol was scattered and low on fuel, having expended their energy in the brutal engagement with the torpedo bombers. As the last of the American torpedo planes disappeared beneath the waves, Nagumo's carriers continued their deadly dance of rearming. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel created a volatile mixture on every flight deck. The admiral checked his watch. It was nearly 10:30, and his strike aircraft were almost ready to launch against the American carriers. He had no way of knowing that, high above his fleet, invisible against the morning sun, the dive bombers of Enterprise and Yorktown were beginning their final approach. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had been airborne for over 2 hours, leading 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in what seemed like a futile search across the empty Pacific. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and several of his pilots were already requesting permission to return to the carrier. The carefully calculated interception course had led them to nothing but vacant ocean and the young squadron commander faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue the search or abort the mission entirely. Then, at 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, white foam streaming from her bow. The ship was moving too fast and too purposefully to be on routine patrol. McCluskey made the intuitive leap that would change naval history. The destroyer was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He banked his formation to follow the warship's wake, gambling his remaining fuel and his pilots' lives on a hunch. 18 minutes later, the gamble paid off in spectacular fashion. Through the morning haze, the unmistakable silhouettes of 4 aircraft carriers appeared, steaming in perfect formation, with their escorting cruisers and destroyers spread around them. In a protective screen, the Japanese fleet was caught in the most vulnerable possible position. Flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, ordnance scattered everywhere, and their combat air patrol scattered at low altitude after the torpedo bomber attacks. McCluskey's dive bombers had arrived at exactly the right moment, but they weren't alone. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was approaching from a different angle, with 17 dauntless bombers from the Yorktown, having found the Japanese fleet by following the smoke from the earlier torpedo attacks. For the first time in the battle, American naval coordination was working perfectly to separate squadrons, converging on the enemy fleet simultaneously from different directions. The Japanese lookouts finally spotted the approaching dive bombers at 10:24, but it was far too late. Air raid sirens wailed across the fleet as the carriers began desperate evasive maneuvers. But the elegant formation that had been their strength now became their weakness. The ships were too close together to maneuver independently, and the flight decks packed with aircraft and ordnance couldn't be cleared in time. McCluskey selected Kaga as his primary target, the massive carrier turning hard to port in a futile attempt to escape. At 14,000 feet, he pushed over into his dive, the Dauntless screaming downward at a 70-degree angle while his squadron followed in sequence. The Zero fighters climbing desperately to intercept were too late and too few. Most of the combat air patrol was still at sea level, trying to regroup after the torpedo attacks. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the island's superstructure at 10:26, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding among the armed aircraft below. The blast triggered a chain reaction as aviation gasoline ignited, and ammunition cooked off in sympathetic explosions. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a blazing inferno. Simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers were attacking Soryu from the opposite direction. The smaller carrier, caught in the middle of launching her own strike aircraft, took 3 direct hits in rapid succession. The first bomb destroyed the flight deck elevator, trapping aircraft in the hangar below. The second penetrated to the engine spaces, while the third detonated among the fueled and armed aircraft on the flight deck. Like her sister ship, Soryu became a floating torch within minutes. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as 2 of his 4 carriers died. Before his eyes, the flagship herself shuddered under the impact of a single bomb that struck just behind the midships elevator. The explosion seemed almost modest compared to the devastation on the other carriers, but it proved equally fatal. The bomb detonated among the armed aircraft waiting to launch, and aviation gasoline spread the flames with terrifying speed. Within 5 minutes of the first bomb impact, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning out of control. The carefully coordinated striking force that had seemed invincible that morning was reduced to a single operational carrier Hiryu steaming desperately to the north, while launching every available aircraft in a desperate counter-strike. Captain Tomio Kaku of Hiryu faced the same impossible situation that had doomed his sister ships. His flight deck was crowded with aircraft being prepared for the planned strike on Midway, but now he needed to launch immediately against the American carriers before they could mount another attack. Ordnance crews worked frantically to arm bombers and fighters while the ship's engines strained to generate enough wind speed for launching heavily loaded aircraft. The destruction of 3 carriers in 5 minutes represented more than a tactical disaster. It was the collapse of 6 months of careful planning and the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The perfect coordination that had made Pearl Harbor possible had been shattered by American intelligence, determination, and a crucial element that no plan could account for: luck. Part 4. The Dragon's Last Breath. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, the sole survivor of what had been the most powerful carrier force in naval history, just 30 Minutes earlier, black smoke from his 3 burning sister ships stained the horizon, while damage control parties on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu fought desperately to save their ships. But Kaku knew the truth, that Admiral Nagumo was still struggling to accept those. Carriers were doomed, their magazines cooking off in secondary explosions that sent pillars of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The responsibility for salvaging Japanese honor now rested entirely on Hiryu's flight deck. Kaku had managed to launch 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters at 1100 hours, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, with orders to find and destroy the American carriers that had devastated the carrier striking force. It was a pitifully small strike compared to the massive formations that had attacked Pearl Harbor, but it was all that remained of Japanese naval aviation in the Central Pacific. The strike found USS Yorktown at 12:10, the American carrier steaming confidently with her escorts, 25 miles northeast of the burning Japanese fleet. The ship's radar had detected the approaching aircraft, and her combat air patrol was positioned to intercept. But the Japanese pilots were veterans of 6 months of Pacific warfare. They had survived Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raids, and they brought all their experience to bear in what they knew might be their final attack. Lieutenant Kobayashi led his dive bombers through the American fighter screen with suicidal determination. 3 of his aircraft were shot down immediately, but the survivors pressed their attack with precision that would have made their instructors proud. At 12:15, 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among the stored aircraft. The second destroyed the ship's radar and communication systems, while the third knocked out several boilers, reducing speed to 6 knots. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Japanese coordination might salvage something from the disaster. Hiryu's first strike had achieved what American intelligence officers would later call remarkable accuracy under impossible conditions, proving that individual Japanese skill and training remained formidable even when overall coordination had collapsed. But the Americans had learned valuable lessons from the morning's carnage. Damage control aboard Yorktown was swift and efficient, drawing on months of intensive training and preparation. Within an hour, the carrier's fires were under control. Her flight deck was operational, and she was making 20 knots enough to launch and recover aircraft. From a distance, she appeared undamaged, leading Japanese reconnaissance to report that they had attacked and sunk an American carrier, when in fact they had barely scratched her. This intelligence failure prompted Captain Kaku to launch Hiryu's second and final strike at 1:30. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway, volunteered to command the mission despite flying an aircraft with a damaged fuel tank. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters represented the last offensive power of the once mighty carrier striking force. Tomonaga's attack at 2:45 was even more determined than the first. The lieutenant knew his fuel situation meant this was a one-way mission, and he pressed his attack with the fatalistic courage that characterized Japanese naval aviation. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on the port side, flooding the engine rooms and causing a severe list that appeared fatal. Maritime historian Craig Simmons notes, in his comprehensive study of the Pacific War, that this second attack represented the high-water mark of individual Japanese tactical skill during the Midway operation. But even as Tomonaga's aircraft were dying in the anti-aircraft fire around Yorktown, American dive bombers were already airborne and searching for Hiryu. Enterprise had launched 24 Dauntless bombers under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher. At 3:30, following the returning Japanese aircraft back to their source, the Americans had learned the same lesson that McCluskey had used to find the original Japanese formation follow the enemy home. At 5:05 in the evening, Gallagher's dive bombers found Hiryu steaming alone except for her escorts, desperately trying to clear her flight deck for defensive operations. The last Japanese carrier had managed to get only 6 Zero fighters airborne when the American bombs began falling. For direct hits in rapid succession transformed Hiryu from an operational warship into a blazing wreck. The bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded among the armed aircraft below. creating the same devastating chain reaction that had destroyed her sister ships within minutes. The hangar was an inferno, and secondary explosions were rocking the ship as her magazines detonate. By 6 in the evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning hulks, their offensive power completely eliminated. Admiral Nagumo, transferred to the cruiser Nagara after abandoning the blazing Akagi, surveyed the wreckage of his fleet with numbed shock. The most powerful naval striking force ever assembled had been reduced to burning scrap metal. In less than 6 hours, the failure of Japanese naval coordination was now complete. What had begun as an elegant plan to destroy American naval power had become the greatest disaster in Japanese naval history, costing for irreplaceable aircraft carriers and most of their veteran aircrews. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the command center of his flagship Yamato, 300 miles west of the burning carrier fleet, trying to comprehend reports that seemed to describe an impossible catastrophe. The man who had conceived the Midway operation as the decisive battle that would end American resistance in the Pacific now faced the collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. The radio messages from Admiral Nagumo painted a picture of devastation that challenged Yamamoto's understanding of naval warfare itself. For fleet carriers destroyed in a single day represented more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic disaster that would take years to recover from, if recovery was even possible. Each carrier had required 3 years to build and another year to work up to combat effectiveness. The trained air crews now burning in the Pacific wreckage represented an even more irreplaceable loss. Yamamoto's staff officers clustered around the radio equipment, their faces pale with shock as more details filtered in. The carrier's striking force, which that morning had represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in the world, now consisted entirely of burning hulks and scattered escort vessels. The entire carefully orchestrated plan had collapsed in less than 6 hours of actual combat. The admiral faced a decision that would determine not just the outcome of the Midway operation, but potentially the entire Pacific War. His main body still included the most powerful battleship ever built, Yamato herself, along with 2 more battleships, several heavy cruisers, and their destroyer escorts. Theoretically, he could continue the operation by closing with the American fleet and engaging in the surface, action that Japanese naval doctrine had always preferred. But the tactical situation had changed fundamentally with the loss of air cover. Without carrier-based fighters to provide protection, his surface ships would be vulnerable to continuous air attack from both the American carriers and Midway's land-based aircraft. The Americans had already demonstrated their ability to coordinate devastating strikes, and they would have all day on June 5th to mount successive attacks against his approaching fleet. Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, argued forcefully, "For continuing the attack, Admiral, we still have overwhelming surface superiority. The Americans have only 3 carriers, and their battleship force is negligible. If we can bring them to surface action, we can still achieve decisive victory." Other staff officers disagreed, pointing out that the fundamental assumptions underlying the Midway plan had proven false. American intelligence had been far better than expected, their pilots more skilled, and their coordination more effective. Continuing the operation would mean steaming into a trap with insufficient air cover, and no hope of surprise. Yamamoto himself remained silent for long minutes, staring at the plotting table that showed the disposition of forces across hundreds of miles of ocean. The mathematical precision that had characterized Japanese naval planning seemed meaningless now that the basic variables had changed so dramatically. His carriers were gone, his aircrew losses were catastrophic, and the Americans held both tactical and strategic initiative. The decision was complicated by considerations that went beyond immediate tactical concerns. The Midway operation had been sold to the Japanese High Command and the Emperor himself as the battle that would end American resistance and secure Japanese control of the Central Pacific. Returning to base without attempting to salvage something from the disaster would be seen as admitting that Japanese naval superiority was an illusion. At 11:45 that evening, Yamamoto finally spoke the words that ended Japanese hopes of Pacific domination. The operation is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to the northwest. The order sent shock waves through the assembled task forces. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force, already approaching Midway from the southwest, with transports full of troops, received orders to reverse course immediately. The Aleutian Diversionary Force, which had successfully occupied Attu and Kiska Islands, suddenly found their victories meaningless without the main operation to support. Naval historian John Parshall's analysis of Japanese communications intercepts reveals the confusion and disbelief that followed Yamamoto's withdrawal order throughout the fleet. The withdrawal itself became a final demonstration of how completely Japanese naval coordination had collapsed. Individual task force commanders, having lost communication with higher authority during the day's fighting, continued operating according to their original orders. Some units didn't receive the withdrawal directive until hours after it was issued, while others questioned whether the orders were authentic. Given the magnitude of the reported disaster, Admiral Nagumo, aboard the cruiser Nagara with the remnants of his carrier striking force, faced his own agonizing decisions about the burning hulks of his carriers. Akagi, despite being the least damaged of the four ships, was burning out of control with her magazines threatening to explode at any moment. The other three carriers were clearly beyond salvation, their structures twisted by internal explosions, and their decks collapsed into the burning hangars. Below, the order to scuttle Akagi came at 5 in the morning on June 5th, delivered by destroyer torpedo strike that sent Yamamoto's former flagship to the bottom of the Pacific. Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu followed throughout the morning, taking with them not just ships but the accumulated experience and expertise of the Japanese naval aviation program. As the sun rose on June 5th, the great Japanese fleet was scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, racing westward in disorganized groups while American submarines and aircraft harassed their retreat. The perfect coordination that had made Pearl Harbor possible had been replaced by confused retreat and individual ship commanders making desperate decisions with incomplete information. The heavy cruiser Megami limped through the pre-dawn darkness of June 5th, her bow crushed and twisted from the collision with her sister ship Mikuma just hours earlier. Captain Akira Soji stood on his damaged bridge, trying to maintain course despite steering gear that responded sluggishly and engines that threatened to fail at any moment. The collision, caused by emergency maneuvers to avoid submarine attack, represented a perfect microcosm of how Japanese naval coordination had completely collapsed. In the aftermath of the carrier disaster. Behind Megami, the cruiser Mikuma struggled to keep pace, fuel oil streaming from her ruptured bunkers and creating a visible trail that could be followed by enemy aircraft for hundreds of miles. Both ships had been part of Vice Admiral Kondo's powerful surface force intended to provide gunfire support for the Midway invasion. Now they were crippled stragglers, abandoned by the main force and racing against time to reach the safety of Japanese-controlled waters. The collision had occurred during the chaotic night withdrawal when individual ship commanders, lacking clear communication with higher authority, made independent decisions about course and speed. The rigid formation discipline that characterized Japanese naval operations had given way to confused maneuvering as captains tried to avoid both enemy submarines and their own consorts in the darkness. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard his flagship, Yamato, received reports of the cruiser collision with grim resignation. Each new piece of bad news seemed to confirm that the Midway disaster was spreading like a contagion through his entire fleet. The withdrawal that should have been an organized retrograde movement had become a rout, with individual units scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean and enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. The submarine USS Tamber, which had triggered the collision by surfacing unexpectedly in the middle of the Japanese formation, continued to shadow the damaged cruisers while transmitting position reports to Admiral Spruance, the American commander, now fully aware that major Japanese surface units were within striking range, prepared to launch every available aircraft against the fleeing enemy. At 600 hours, Enterprise and Hornet began launching the strike that would demonstrate how completely the tactical initiative had shifted to American forces. 81 aircraft dive bombers, Torpedo planes and fighters formed up and headed northwest toward the oil slick that marked Makuma's position. For the first time in the Pacific War, American naval aviation was hunting wounded Japanese warships with the same ruthless efficiency that Japanese pilots had shown at Pearl Harbor. Captain Richard Fleming of Marine Bombing Squadron 241, flying from Midway itself, led his obsolete Vindicator dive bombers in what would prove to be the final act of his military career. Fleming's aircraft, damaged by anti-aircraft fire during its attack run on Makuma, continued its dive even after being mortally hit. The Marine captain, either dead at the controls or choosing to make the ultimate sacrifice, crashed his bomber directly into Makuma's after turret, creating an explosion that sent flames throughout the ship's stern sections. The attack on the fleeing cruisers lasted throughout the morning of June 5th, with successive waves of American aircraft pounding the damaged ships until Makuma finally succumbed to her wounds. The heavy cruiser rolled over and sank at 1,300 hours, taking most of her crew with her. Magami, despite suffering additional bomb hits that reduced her superstructure to twisted wreckage, managed to survive and eventually limped back to truck for repairs that would take nearly a year to complete. The loss of Makuma represented more than another tactical defeat. It demonstrated that Japanese naval forces could no longer operate safely anywhere within range of American aircraft. The immunity from effective enemy air attack that had characterized the first 6 months of the Pacific War was permanently broken. In Tokyo, the full magnitude of the Midway disaster was beginning to penetrate the consciousness of the naval general staff. Initial reports had been fragmentary and confusing, with communications disrupted by battle damage and the vast distances involved. But by June 6th, the scope of the catastrophe was undeniable. For fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser and over 3,000 trained personnel had been lost in exchange for negligible damage to American forces. According to Japanese Defense Agency historical records declassified in 1983, the initial reaction in Tokyo was complete disbelief that such losses were possible. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, faced the impossible task of explaining to Emperor Hirohito how the operation that was supposed to secure decisive victory had instead handed the Americans their greatest triumph since the war began. The careful balance of forces that had made Japanese expansion possible was permanently altered, with American industrial capacity now free to build the ships and aircraft that would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses. The human cost was equally devastating. The veteran air crews lost at Midway represented the core of Japanese naval aviation expertise, men who had trained for years before the war and gained invaluable combat experience. During the first months of fighting, these pilots could not be quickly replaced, and their loss would handicap Japanese carrier operations for the remainder of the war. Perhaps most significantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered not just for American forces, but for Japanese commanders themselves. The careful calculations and precise planning that had characterized Japanese naval operations would never again proceed with the confidence that had marked the Pearl Harbor attack and the early months of Pacific expansion. 3 months after Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in his cabin aboard the flagship Yamato, anchored in the supposedly secure waters of Truk Lagoon, reading intelligence reports that confirmed his worst fears about the battle's long-term consequences. American industrial production was accelerating at a rate that exceeded even his most pessimistic pre-war estimates, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace the carriers lost in a single day of fighting. The reports spread across his desk told a story of strategic collapse disguised as tactical adjustment. Construction of new aircraft carriers had been accelerated, but the earliest replacements wouldn't be ready until 1944, nearly 2 years away. Meanwhile, American yards were launching new carriers every few months, each one incorporating lessons learned from the Pacific fighting and equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar and communication systems. More troubling was the pilot shortage that Midway had created. The veteran air crews, who had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable, were irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. New pilots were being rushed through abbreviated training programs, but they lacked the experience and skill that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. Every engagement since Midway had demonstrated the declining quality of Japanese naval aviation, with inexperienced pilots falling victim to increasingly confident American fighters. The intelligence reports also revealed the broader implications of the coordination failure that had doomed his carriers. American code-breaking capabilities had proven far more sophisticated than Japanese intelligence had estimated, giving enemy commanders unprecedented insight into Japanese planning and movements. The element of surprise that had been crucial to early Japanese victories was permanently compromised. Captain Kuroshima entered the admiral's cabin with the latest operational summaries from the Solomon Islands campaign, where Japanese forces were struggling to maintain their positions against increasingly aggressive American attacks. The reports painted a picture of declining Japanese capabilities. Across all operational categories, fewer ships, Japanese naval coordination failed. Once Midway disrupted their plan,